folks begin to join, would love anyone in the chat, say where you're coming in from, where are folks currently at. And actually anyone in the chat, just say hello so we know the chat is working. And we'll quickly make sure that's the case. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, David, Mike, Alec. Appreciate it. Perfect. Chat looks like it's working fine. Great. Well, as folks join, before we get started, I give a little bit of context into sort of the origin story of this webinar, which is probably well known for folks on the call. AI is buzzy. AI is exciting. In San Francisco, if you were located here, it is on every other billboard on the highway. And so largely the focus of this webinar was to get into the tactics, get into the questions that we hear all the time from teams. And so I'm really excited to have this time with everyone, give folks some context. I will go ahead and get us started and share our slides. Perfect. Can folks see my screen? Perfect. All right. So as we get started, again, focus of the conversation today is how accountants can leverage AI. So most of our focus is going to be on getting into the tactics. We have two great AI accounting practitioners here today to kick off this conversation. And so really we'll start directly by having both of them introduce themselves.
I can go first. Hello, everybody. My name is Saumya. I am currently the controller at OpenAI. I joined OpenAI because I, was excited at the opportunity to really apply AI tools and in our workflows to help with the hyper growth phase of this company. Very excited to be here today.
Awesome. I'm also really excited to be here. My name is Parker. I'm one of the co-founders here at Numeric. At Numeric, we provide a number of solutions to corporate accounting teams from the record to report process, primarily around how do you manage your close process, how do you manage a lot of the variance analysis and reporting requirements, as well as some new kind of subledger and technical accounting tools as well. It has been a total privilege to get to know Samia over the course of a couple of years now, and to get her feedback on everything and anything under the sun, from some of the things that we've tried to do that she has told us we're totally crazy about, to some of the things where we've sort of elicited the sort of responses which we're looking for, which is real excitement and sort of energy. So yeah, really excited to hopefully make this just as much of a casual conversation as possible, and discuss some of the things that we're both seeing in the market today.
Awesome. So roadmap for the call today, getting into that, first we'll talk at a high level of how should accountants think about when to use AI, what are good, unique tasks that AI is well suited for today, maybe on the horizon tomorrow. We'll spend the bulk of our time then on practical use cases. So how are Parker and Samia seeing accountants use AI today, things that you could actively consider rolling out to your team? We hear a lot then that folks are, if they are interested in implementing AI, are concerned about what are potentially new risks. How should they think about navigating that risk landscape? And so we'll have both of them touch on how they coach teams to think about new risk associated with AI. And then we'll stumble upon the future of the accounting teams. What will accounting team organization look like? What new skill sets are going to become increasingly important for accountants to develop? And then finally, we'll sort of kick things off or end things up with how teams can practically get started. So some good first steps as you're beginning to think about maybe putting in some of those use cases covered into motion. So to start things off, really just framing this of how should accountants think about using AI, kind of cutting through that fluff, and starting with you, Samia. I know we had talked a little bit about how your team thinks about when to use AI as one of the many tools in your toolkit.
Yeah, for sure. Reflecting back on the way that we've really been able to use AI across the whole team, I think it was very much a bottoms-up adoption, and not so much like somebody, sitting at the top and saying like, okay, we're all going to start using AI today. And the way that I personally thought was quite successful here was people just started thinking about what are the bottlenecks in our close process? What are the things that, you have a huge workbook that is incredibly slow. It makes your computer freeze and you have to come back 3 hours later because it takes that long to compute. And then you really question, like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And we kind of look to ChatGPT at the time. There's other AI tools right now as a solution that we hadn't previously considered.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think it's sort of from our vantage point, right, thinking about just closed processes in these workflows at large. I think a lot of the push is how do teams every month think about just sort of the marginal improvements, right? Because I think there can be such a temptation, whether it's the accounting function or any function, to try and really think about how do we radically like just redo things and start from zero. And so often what really makes a big difference is just every period thinking about where are the places you can get 20 minutes, an hour back, where is the place where you feel like you have the most leverage to go, and then sort of how can you apply AI to that, right, or other solutions. But I think these are some good examples of places. And I think certainly today, in terms of these solutions on the market, there's a lot of amazing products to use, and there's a lot of different ways to go test them and try new things. But a lot of them are sort of, again, places on the margin of where can you go help these tools, use these tools to help you move faster. And I think these are some great examples of places we certainly see folks from. These AI tools are just amazing at pulling data out of documents, out of large data sets, helping you synthesize those informations. And as well as sort of like then there's sort of generation, right? From how do we think about generating policies to memos to understanding just how we actually account for things, right? How we, can we insert certain data sets or information and actually get the adjustments and sort of, data we want back out. One of the nice parts about accounting is there's a very oftentimes a very clear goal, right? The goal is like generate the credits and debits with the right audit trails and information to get there. And so you kind of have a nice flow of what are you trying to kind of goal seek for and get as that output.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, that kind of stumbles upon the question that we hear all the time. And our team has spent a long time thinking about of will accountants be replaced by AI? Something that if you hop into any accountant Reddit thread, you see about once a week at this point. So Samia, Parker, would love to hear how you think about this question when it's asked to you. Samia, if you want to kick us off.
It's always, I chuckle a bit whenever I see this because one, I am an accountant. So this, no matter how much I love AI, I also do care about like the future of the profession. And every time you read these articles about AI is here and it can do so many things, at the very top of the list of jobs that AI might automate and take away, accounting is always up there. I sometimes question like, is this just because of alphabetical order or like, like the most at risk? I don't quite know. I think I think about this a couple ways. One, uh, AI is a new and quite powerful tool that we can add to our tool set. Um, accounting in if you define accounting as the set of tasks and the work that we do today, that will likely go away in maybe the near future because the tools that we have are just much better. And what I mean by that is if you take kind of narrowly a particular close process that you do every single month, and you kind of pick apart like, okay, you have inputs and you have to do something to it and you get outputs. I think that the way that you do something to your inputs will change pretty drastically with AI. In some cases, it may go away entirely because you've now put the system that is able to, I say think in air quotes, maybe not quite think, but is able to quite well like process the input in a way really similar to what humans were doing up until now. I think and so in that narrow sense, sure, some accountants' work it has been replaced by AI, but do I think accounting as a whole or accountants' role as a whole is going to get replaced? I don't see that because in practice, right? And the analogy I always give is when you have to sit down with business partners and convince them of, customer support needs to be in cost of revenue and not OpEx. That is very rarely like a founder is not going to read ChatGPT and be like, oh, cool. Like, yeah, it's told me that. So I'm going to go do that. It is a lot of discussion. It's a lot of debate. It's a lot of like, this is how we think about it. This is why it matters. This is why, we want to have a real picture of our gross margins and not just this like rosy picture without the costs that truly matter. And I think that second part of what being an accountant really brings to a business, that is not going to go away, in my opinion. And in fact, I'm quite optimistic that with tools getting better, the amount of time we have to just like wrangle these massive annoying files and just like, bang your head at the computer goes down over time and hopefully creates more space for some of these like just people working well together to push a business forward.
Yeah, yeah, I fundamentally agree on these points, and I think the thing that we should be really excited about is that notion that one, software is going to get much more intelligent, and I think sort of thinking about the fact that it really is the software getting a lot smarter. That notion of processing and that translation layer, I think, is a really good example. And from my perspective, that's just some of the most frustrating, repetitive, recurring time that just gets blocked. And hopefully, we really are pushing to a place where people have more of their time to actually go focus on the higher level functions, the strategic things, the functions that are really going to propel that business forward. Because if you look at accounting teams' calendars, like so much of it ends up getting blocked by producing the underlying data, getting the system right, making sure all the data is correct and accurate. And if we can really streamline those processes, my hopes would be you see folks blocking out, days of the first week or two of the month to go do more strategic work, to do the planning, to do the sort of understanding of how they propel their function and their team forward. And I think the day to day will look pretty dramatically different, but the understanding and the depth of knowledge of how should we think about accounting for things, how should we make the right decisions that put the business in the best position possible to operate, to execute from. You sort of start to think more about this like systems architect, right? More about this job where your goal is to really go map and graph the financial data and these systems and ensure that everything is sort of functioning at a really high level. And then you can sort of continue to develop from there. So I think we should be really excited about the fact that hopefully this takes a lot of the most recurring work off of people's plates. And then we can really focus on, okay, what are the things we can do to propel the business forward?
Absolutely.
And that kind of gets into, I think, Parker, you touched on what can AI not tackle, and some of that being systems thinking and architecture. Samya, any notes to sort of add of like where you think about landscape that AI can't touch, things that are still very, very human?
I think this just about covers it. I think the only thing I'd add to this is AI is evolving very quickly, and it's a little bit different from just the software world pre-AI, where you had software that was built to tackle a particular business process, and you implement that. It streamlines things, but it's not actually changing under your feet the way AI is. And so my one and this is personally how I think about it, not trying to be preachy, but as an accountant that cares about my own future, the way I think about it is, the wave is coming, whether you want it or not. So the only way is to ride the wave. And by that, I mean staying nimble, staying curious about new technology, doing what we're doing today, like hearing from other people in the profession on what are you doing to practically use these and put these in practice in your work, right? And I think the more we do that, the more we stay on top of the technology, and the more we are able to harness it for our benefit. Because this slide of what AI cannot tackle, this is not a static slide. Maybe 6 months later, if we were to have the same conversation, maybe it will actually be capable of doing deeper analysis and insights into underlying data. But then maybe that gets replaced by some other thing here. So just this notion of what it can and cannot do is changing on the order of like days, not, months and years.
Also makes being a AI accounting software company all the more fun. I know at least on our side, and Parker can definitely speak to this, that has caused us to really rethink how we begin to architect our platform too. So to kind of recap here, and before we get into the practical use cases, I think foundationally point that's coming across is how teams are spending their time is about to change. What a given week, what a given day looks like for accountants is about to change. And a lot more of that work will end up in the sort of interpreting, advising, architecting space as opposed to some of the more manual workflows. So the point that everyone's been waiting for, we've talked at a really high level. How should teams think about AI? What are those distinct use cases? What does the future look like for accountants? Let's get into practical use cases. So Parker, I'll go ahead and pivot it to you to sort of talk about the first use case here of generating policy memos.
Yeah, awesome. So I think kind of to one of the slides we shared earlier about some of the individual use cases, I think one of the places that AI is obviously very good right out of the box for is these places where we're trying to generate text. We're trying to go leverage huge databases of information, whether that's public company comps, whether that's, SEC filings, right? The actual gap guidances and things themselves. And that really then comes through to this question of like, okay, how should we think about more intelligently getting to the question of how should we account for something, right? And so I think that sort of intent is really important and something that today these systems can really go help with. And it's been really cool to build a product and a tool where we get to sit down with folks and just sort of get a sense of all different levels of questions that they might want to ask. And it is like 1,000 times more varied than I would have ever expected going into this, right? When it comes to all the nuance from how certain things in certain municipals are handled, right? To how things are handled globally under different standards, to how do we now start to relate that as directly as possible to underlying documents, policies, the context, right? And I think Samia will probably talk to sort of this question of like what are very generic sort of tools like ChatGPT really great for, where then the sort of role of more dedicated specific products. And it's something we think a lot about, unsurprisingly. And I think for us, that question comes into really most fundamentally, like, what can you do when you have more context about the business, right? If you understand, things like who are their auditors, right? What industries are they in? What are their public companies that are most relevant? Being able to start to now enrich things with the accounting specific information, that stuff starts to get helpful. Now, when you start to understand a company's chart of accounts, you start to understand what's actually on a company's balance sheet. What are they actually accounting for? Now you can start to get a little bit further in terms of the information you can provide that's more directly relevant. And then you can get into what are their actual policies, their libraries of docs, their underlying data files, right? And you sort of see this progression of, okay, how do these things get more and more useful over time when that becomes more and more directly applicable? So we will not spend much time kind of going through the product itself, but we'll just do one sort of very quick example here. Kind of within some of the things that we see are really helpful is just this exact combination, right? So if we want to come in and, have a conversation, what we can do is now actually start to go, like I mentioned, pull in our auditor information, pull in public company comps. We can actually start to pull in documents from companies' file storage systems. And now we can actually go start to get to the question of like, okay, how should we think about accounting for changes in the business, whether that's new contracts that need to update policies, whether that's new leases that are signed, and we want to understand how do we adjust our schedules and our templates. Again, through the sort of really just sort of fractal nature of all sorts of different accounting and kind of questions. So I think we'll sort of pause here and just kind of move on to the next example because the goal here is not to go through 100 different examples of this. But I think the kind of point here, right, is we're trying to really find this intersection of the best understanding of a company's position, their goals, their policies, their workflows, and then using AI to most quickly leverage that and kind of build on that foundation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Awesome. So kind of a high level, sort of hitting in that generation and a little bit of the editing example that we touched on. Samia, something you had talked about is actually using ChatGPT's GPT functionality to be able to help other team members, maybe outside of the accounting team. I'd love for you to touch on this use case.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're not familiar with GPTs, think of them as like templated ChatGPT, where you can pre-feed it. If you're the builder of a GPT, you can basically give it, this is the type of input you should expect. This is the type of output you should expect. So in this example, I built a GPT called Spend Policy. If you know me, I tend to be quite like, I just don't like it when people ping me a lot asking for the same things because it's a bit of a distraction and I don't think it's particularly high value work. So when I see an opportunity like that, I try to say, can I build like a product around this or can I build a system around this to make this go away? And this is actually something I tell my team too. It's like you want to kind of lean into your tinge of laziness and really like build your systems and solutions around those areas. So spend policy is for people reaching out to me on Slack and saying, hey, I want to spend money on this. What is our policy for this? How do I get something reimbursed? I want to do a team event. So in this example, I basically said, I want to get some team swag, which happens a lot. What is our policy? And so the GPT basically can, I've given it our expense policy docs, and I've uploaded like our how-to guides for how to submit a expense report, how to get a virtual card, like all of that is in this GPT template. So now when somebody goes to the spend policy and just starts talking to it, it basically has the things that I would have leveraged to answer the same question. So this is a nice way for you to kind of get your hands wet on a kind of low stakes example. So maybe after this call, I would encourage you to go play around with this and see, it's very, you don't need to know any coding. It is as simple as dragging and dropping and typing things in. The nice thing about ChatGPT is it is the only language you need to know is just the language you speak to a normal person, and you don't need to know Python, you don't need to know SQL, you don't need to really know anything beyond just like I English. Um, in terms of what does this mean for a user? Sorry, I'm also looking at the questions in parallel. What does it mean for a user to go to the spend policy? This is actually, so we have a ChatGPT enterprise workspace. So if you have a team on an enterprise workspace, you'll have access to the GPTs created by other people in your workspace. So think of this as like, if your company has like a Notion or Confluence for, different team policies, this is a different way to engage with those. Instead of having people read like a 20-page doc, you can basically have them just ask the question that they really want answered.
I love the lean into your tinge of laziness. uh, Definitely a good quote to come out of here. Awesome. So on the leaning into tinge of laziness and thinking about other ways that you can sort of have AI do the heavy lifting. Another use case you talked about, Samya, was using AI as a co-pilot for code generation, for data analysis. Would love to hear you talk about this use case.
I put this in here. This is kind of quite a lot to digest, and I don't think I'm gonna delve into like, how are we really gonna like generate this Python script? How are we gonna run it? I think there's tons of resources available, but the thing that I'm trying to get to is like, what is a practical use case of how we put AI into use, right? And I'll give you an example. For the year-end audit, I was putting together this like payroll history data from an HR system at the time, which we were using, which didn't actually store historical data. Like you couldn't just run a year-to-date report that showed people's like, say, salaries over the course of a year to like give our auditors. And so what I did find was a change report. So it basically had people's like a date, and then their employee ID, and then the new salary. And I was like, okay, I could either sit in Excel and try to stitch this whole thing together by, having their existing thing and like have a bunch of lookup formulas to check, is this date, smaller than this date, or is this date larger than this date? And, you could do this in Excel, but instead, I don't know if it's easy for you guys to see, but I basically just brain dumped into ChatGPT. I said, I need help. I have this file. It has these columns. I need the output to be this way. I need these columns. Just like whatever I would say to a person sitting next to me, I'm basically typing my stream of consciousness into ChatGPT. And then it magically just says, okay, well, let me give you step by step the things I could do to help you. And then it actually tried to like run this for me in here. But I said, well, what if the auditors want to reproduce this? So I said, actually, give me a Python script that I can save offline. And then I will do that. So the beautiful thing about this is if I had to do this one more time, it is basically like zero extra effort because I just feed in a new input file and out comes a new output file. So if they suddenly said, can I see this for the year before the current period, then like it doesn't take any extra work. Whereas if I'd set this up in Excel, then you know what to do, but it's still like something that you have to do. So the practical use case here is whenever you are tasked with some kind of what I call data wrangling, just pause because all of our accounting instincts point to like Google Sheets or Excel, and you're like, I know exactly what to do. But it's almost like maybe that's not the best thing to do because you can now have this tool that is very general purpose and just have it like write tools or like code something up for you that you might not otherwise have done. I'll pause there. I know that's kind of a mouthful. Parker, if you have any like things to add on to, happy to, or if you want me to clarify. But I do think this is one of the most powerful ways we use ChatGPT here.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that sort of notion is really great around how, you can go use these things more consistently to then go drive the next and next applications, right? Because so much of this work is recurring, right? So many of these processes are things that we are going to go do multiple times. And so kind of creating those frameworks and places that you can go save down. I think there's kind of this interesting layer and sort of overall class of software, both kind of ChatGPT, but also otherwise that's kind of going to start to emerge, which is somewhere between a spreadsheet and a point solution, right? We're going to end up with all these tools where there's just a way greater level of customization and composability to build these workflows and processes, but also more structure and more connectivity, right, to your overall system. And I think that's sort of like these things continue to fit in these theme that we get really excited about just because I think it will end up with kind of like this workflow, like just better software, more tailored to a company's direct specific use cases that is flexible enough on the margin, but you can then go use that data for lots of purposes. So I think this is a great example and just sort of indicative of kind of this continued trend that we're going to see across software types.
We did get a couple of follow-up questions related to this. One of them from Michael around what do you think the best approach for using AI for contract review in a safe environment? So I know we'll get into a Q&A section later, but any quick notes on probably something related to ChatGPT, potentially Samya, Parker, any thoughts on sort of how to do that and scan it for accounting implications?
I'm happy to take this. I think we might actually cover this later, but um, this is a perfect segue into how to actually think about what tool do you plug into the type of problem you have. So I'm also reading ahead to Patty's question on how do we, subscribe in order to keep privacy? How do you make sure the data is safe? I think we have a slide on this later, but basically when you're putting confidential data into these tools, you want to go through the same like IT security vetting that you would do for any software system. And I can't speak for every vendor, but like, and Parker, you should speak to Numeric, but ChatGPT, the team and enterprise plan, but also I think Plus and Free allow you to turn off the ability to train on your data. We've actually decoupled that from being on a paid plan. So every user of ChatGPT has the ability to opt out of training. If you are using company data on this workspace, then your IT team will most likely require you to be on a Teams plan. If your IT team wants to do like, single sign-on and more like enterprise level admin, then there's plans for that. But definitely talk to your company security team before you put any data in, just from like a best practice perspective. But the AI tools are not any more risky than a typical like cloud software provider. I know Numeric, for example, has like pretty large like companies and finance team that trust people to put their products in. Now, when going back to Michael's question on what do you think is the best approach for contract review, the way that I think about, so take ChatGPT and Numeric as an example, but you can sub in your tool of choice. This is not like a particular thing that I'm trying to push or anything, but I think of ChatGPT as being this very flexible tool that you can do any ad hoc work on, whereas Numeric is plugged into your existing workflows. What I mean is if ChatGPT is a blank Excel spreadsheet. Oh, there you go. We had a slide on this.
We're ready.
So if ChatGPT is a blank like Excel workbook or a blank Google Sheet, and you can do whatever you need on it, and you're kind of like putting your thoughts together. Personally, I love having it tabulate things for me. I just understand things better in the table format than like long bullets or a big essay. Like those things are great in a general purpose tool. But once you have things that need to happen within your closed process, whether that's like a variance analysis that needs to be tied back to like where did we reconcile this account, and you don't want all of those to live somewhere in disparate chats on people's accounts. How do you stitch that all together in a way that is really easy to look back on, in a way that like, Numeric, for example, has like a really good NetSuite transaction level sync. And you want to be able to like do this certain type of work within the construct of the system so that you have, you know, all the other software capabilities around it. You can report on things, you can have analytics on how your close timelines are trending in Numeric's example. For contract review, you know, like Clarity is a really popular name where you can essentially plug them into Ironclad, or you can feed it contracts and it helps you parse things out using AI. So my general thought is when you're doing like repeatable work, you want to put a system around that. But you know what we're doing at OpenAI is we're trying to implement systems and tools that have these AI capabilities embedded in them. So that like the team not only has a way to streamline the work, we also are able to leverage AI functionality to actually just like make the work itself much less. I'll pause there. That was a mouthful, but over to you, Parker, if you want to add
I,
it.
I don't
Yeah.
have too much. I don't have too much to add. I kept thinking I would jump in and sort of with the next sort of piece of that, and then you just kept nailing it. So yeah, I totally, I think on the infosec side of things, I think this is great. If you guys want to keep dropping questions in, that this is kind of more fun to meander through the deck than necessarily just present. Um, uh, what we've seen sort of from the practical perspective is companies are purchasing tools that have AI as like a core function of them today. I think you're probably pretty hard pressed to find companies that haven't gone through this procurement process and started to just set up those lanes of like what is acceptable practices and what are not. So at least from our experience, we've seen that a lot of the ways that we work with OpenAI as sort of an enterprise provider of the large language models is like just very consistent with products that are in marketing, that are in sales, that are in operations. And so I think the first and foremost is like it's up to every company individually to do their infosec processes and review, right? Like every company has to own their destiny and their decisions around the companies and products they work with in those tools. Um, but I think you typically start to find in the accounting space that these decisions have already been made pretty consistently, and there are sort of practices that people are getting more increasingly sort of comfortable and standardized around. I do think it obviously makes sense to make sure that vendors have their SOC 2, potentially their SOC 1, depending on what the workflow is, right, for these processing. Um, uh, um, and every vendor should have to own the fact that they need to go put their best foot forward and need to have very clear, very explicit answers and all the data ready to go demonstrate what are they doing, how are they doing it, and you should, this is kind of consistent with every question a vendor should get, but like there should be no sort of exception for folks not having the right documentation and sort of materials ready to go.
Great. So kind of jumped ahead a little bit into the, is my data secure? Is my information being used to train AI tools? Do want to hop back to Sami's general thinking on you have this general purpose tool like a ChatGPT, and then you also have workflow specific tools. And so fourth use case that we wanted to highlight, Parker, I'll kick it over to you to sort of talk about one of the places in our product where teams get really excited related to drafting variance explanations. So we'll have you show that up, kind of be the last practical use case, and then we can hop right back into security questions because I know that's obviously top of mind for folks.
Cool. Yeah, we'll keep this really brief. Again, kind of to one of the earlier slides, I think one of the places that you see AI being just really great out of the box is for synthesizing data, right? And so one of the nice parts about the question then every company has to answer is like, what's unique about the business? And for us, it's we sit on top of this really rich general ledger data from memos, vendors, departments, classes, locations, project codes. The data people want to pull into Numeric is pretty rich. And then how do you build that into the workflows? And so some of the things you can do that are really helpful, just as an example, right, is pulling up the underlying transactions and pivoting and kind of double clicking into things. And that's all the same tools that then really helps, kind of actually drive automatically drafting explanations. So it's really common for us to see companies now automatically drafting anywhere from 20 to 70% plus of their explanations each month using AI. We've given people increasingly different tools, and we're always trying to think through the design implications. How do you make this better? I would say right now, one of the things we're really good at is pulling all the data from within a sort of population, whether that's a GL code or a group of accounts or what it's summarizing. And we've been really thinking hard about how do you pull in other data? How do you pull in data from related accounts if you want to explain cost of revenue accounts, but related to revenue changes or billing. So there's all these sort of interesting ways that I think these products from a design perspective will get a lot better. And then you also just see you're riding off the coattails of the folks like OpenAI, where the models are getting better too. And so you sort of have these like multiple functions all moving in the right direction, which is the models are getting better, the products are getting better. I think our comfort with using these products is getting better. But we do see a lot of then folks coming in, editing, changing things, adding additional context and descriptions on top of those. Um, and that's been really fun. We have one company that has been really fun to work with, and one of their sort of common use cases now has been they hand off all their Flux explanations to their finance team, and they'll actually write one of them as a poem each month. And they're sort of looking to see if the finance team will catch it and sort of double check that they're actually paying attention to the fluxes and things. And there's also some fun here, right, to hopefully sort of have some lighthearted humor as part of these processes too, which obviously not the core purpose, but is fun.
I remember seeing this for the first time a little while ago now, right, Parker? And the feeling of wow, this is like magic, never really goes away. And I think it's just this notion of you have access to transaction level NetSuite data, and for the accountants in the room, if you remember, like how we do fluxes manually and what this tool is doing in the click of a button is actually kind of thinking about it in a very similar way, except it's just way faster because that's just where the tech is today. So this will never like fail to be magical for me, I think.
Yeah. And it's been really fun to get people's feedback. I think like these are such fun products to work on because everything is so new that you don't necessarily just have a staple of like examples of the way it's always been done. And so I think it's been such a privilege to get to work with companies where they're coming back with real feedback too. And they're telling us like some of these are terrible and they're not great. And here's what we need to make it better. And then some of these are really awesome. And how do we do more of that? And how do we get the flexibility and templatizing of things, always improve. So yeah, a really fun area. Um, I think one more thing to note, which I know wasn't on the agenda, but I think there's been this sort of conversation now around like kind of this translation of like how do you get to credits and debits, sort of that AI is going to be good for this sort of layer of interpreting information, building these processes. And so one thing I thought might be just really kind of I thought the audience might enjoy to just see very briefly is kind of something we've been working on that addresses just that. And so we've really been thinking through this question of like, what does it look like to build really flexible schedules, subledgers, workflows where you can really use this somewhere between this sort of spreadsheet, but also sort of isn't necessarily directly a point solution. And so one of the things we've now been building out and have some early customers testing and using is this notion that we could actually go start to build out completely unique schedules and subledgers from how you want to track convertible notes to accruals to fixed assets to revenue accounts to all sorts of different things, but then inserting any number of different workflows and AI sort of powered flows. So what we just saw here is I just dropped in a handful of invoices. That's actually going to go pull out all the information we need to go create, in this circumstance, depreciation entries and schedules. But what's really fun is and sort of unique is you can also come in and say I wanted to like pull in, quantity or departments or serial codes or IDs or things. What we can now do is really make this again really flexible to go pull out the information. So what is the quantity of assets? And then these are things that now we can go scan again, rescan the documents, flexibly go pull out more information and go start to build hopefully this sort of mix of really operationally useful information as well as to the credits and debits. And then as well as also adjusting things based on description. So if you want to come in and say, I want to dispose of this asset, now we can go look out to the guidances that your company, maintains, whether it's GAAP or IFRS or otherwise, right? We can actually then go use that data to come back and say, here's the adjustment, here's how the schedule should change, here's how we're going to update this. And you have these really cool sort of connections now because you also have this really amazing audit trail because now you can say, great, like, why did Samya dispose of this asset? Well, we can see she wanted to dispose of it for this reason. Here's the guidance. Here's the output of that work. Here's the credits and debits. And so those are really, really kind of, I think novel ways of how we start to think about these systems starting to change and adapt to be much more flexible and much more reflective of the business. So anyway, sorry, I know that's a little off reservation. Tierney, please forgive me and don't yell at me after. But
No, no worries, no worries. I think cool to see a little bit of the future, I think, for a lot of folks, even though it is in early days. All right, we have so many questions that are coming in, which I'm really excited to get into. So I see quite a few of those questions actually touch on the topic of risk. And so I think we hit on sort of the high level, how we should think about security for those. I think probably makes sense to touch on a couple of those active chats. So one of the questions that actively came up was trying to navigate to those now. One of those was related to, here we go. Sorry, I don't know if Parker, can you easily access these Q&A? Zoom is not making it easy for me.
Yes, yeah. There's a separate sort of box for the Q&A as opposed to the chat. What was the question?
Yep, just looking at, I know there's a couple folks in the Q&A who had asked specifically about security related questions, and so I'm trying to get to those, but can't while I'm screen sharing. So,
Got it. Yeah, I think there definitely been a couple questions around confidentiality. I think we kind of have covered most of these, in the sort of sense of overarching this sort of perspectives of think through our models getting trained on this data, are they not? So I think we've covered the ones that I've seen thus far, but we'll take a look.
perfect.
I think there's one theme, which is how do auditors think about the use of this?
Yes.
I'm happy to chime in on that. So we had tools like this being used all of last year, and Deloitte is our auditor. I have to say, audit firms are also equally curious about this, and I wouldn't be surprised if we have people today in this call who are, not on the accounting side of the table, but on the audit side of the table. And I think there's a few principles that, don't really change whether you use AI tools or not. One is to document, the methodology, to leave the audit trail. One thing that we've done is when we use these like code generation type tools, we keep that static script saved, or if it needs to be dynamic, imagine like new product lines are coming and you need to tweak it every month. We keep like a version control history of it with similar to how the engineers in your company likely use GitHub, and like there's this history of the change that happened, who reviewed it, who approved it, the questions that were asked. Like this is no different from that. Um, Audit teams are, starting to think they probably need somebody slightly more like kind of technical, not just technical accounting, but also like systems technical and code savvy that is able to like read and process SQL queries and Python scripts beyond Excel workbooks. So that's been a little bit of a shift. Um, for the things like imagine, you asked it to write a memo for you, right? The way that we frame it internally is it's very much like a preparer tool. It's never the final output. Like, none of our internal memos will say written by ChatGPT, reviewed by X. It's actually like whoever is tasked with it can use it as a leverage tool for themselves. But ultimately, it's still the onus is still on that preparer to go through it, see if it makes sense, make the edits. And so we're not there yet where we can pass off responsibility for an output to the AI tool entirely. I think of it as like a, magical tool you have in your back pocket to just be incredibly efficient.
Perfect. So talked a lot about data security, trust. I think Samia totally hit on this point. We're getting to that 80% mark. Humans are definitely still involved for that final review phase to make sure everything is accurate and trustworthy. And getting to that like trust but verify general thinking of course, you want to use this for research, you want to use this to speed up time, but still requires that human layer. So getting into then and sort of before we round out before Q&A, what does the future look like for accountants, for accounting teams? And so would love both Samya and Parker your input on what is the accounting team of 2023 just around the horizon, sort of what does that team begin to look like as these AI tools become more widespread?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here and start. Uh, I think it's likely that what we're seeing is um, I think anytime we see these foundational sort of softwares and sort of technologies change, like there's a new skill set that starts to be learned, and you're going to see the sort of shift of companies that are moving really quickly are trying to push the boundaries on what are they adopting, how are they thinking about things, how are they testing things, right? And it's almost like getting into this routine of, okay, maybe every month we're closing the books, but every month we're also trying to go test some new idea or hypothesis about how these tools can help us get more efficient and how we can utilize them in novel ways, right? I do think the goal here and certainly our hopes and is that accounting teams can continue to embed themselves closer and closer to the business. Right. I think foundationally, accounting teams have access to the underlying data that helps people make the best decisions possible. And it is the goal to structure that most usefully, to code it, to allocate it, to make sure it's tracked as granularly as possible so we can tee things up for people to go then utilize it as effectively as possible. And I think we should be really trying to foster those tighter knit relationships and closer business partner relationships such that we can utilize the function as best as possible. But Sami, I'm curious what you think here.
Yeah, I think echo a lot of that. one thing that's been true for us is we are just a much leaner team than the industry average for our peer group. And, some of it is just like necessity. The company grew really, really quickly in a way that we couldn't have even grown by hiring people. Like there's just a certain amount of time it takes to hire somebody. But the flip side of that is the way we've been able to survive that kind of growth is by leveraging these tools. So by extension, if you kind of set out to build an accounting team of the future, I think the expectations of what a person can accomplish are just like a step function higher than even like 2, 3 years ago. So that's been really exciting to see. The other thing that I've noticed is, the strong like technical accounting foundation and the ability to like put the mental models you build in the accounting world into practice and business, those aren't really going away. But we are seeing that the people that are really successful tend to be like more broad skilled, more like generalists, because they're able to like plug and play into a lot more business processes than maybe previously. There's just this enormous volume of work in one area, so they had to really specialize in that. But yeah, I think this is, we've just jumped straight into the new accountant skill set. I agree, like, abstract thinking, systems thinking. Parker, you alluded to this earlier, right? Like accountants have to really take this role of how do I architect this business process start to end? And I think a lot of my time, a lot of our team's time goes into this. We basically end to end look at a process or a workflow and then think about where can we inject tools in a smart way to really minimize you know, the the bottlenecks in the process.
Yeah, I loved when we were chatting earlier, Samia, the idea of being a micro product manager, almost thinking about that process from the lens of someone who works in product of what are we trying to do? What are sort of the toolkit available? And then the internal GPT being one point example of sort of a product that an accounting team has built, which is fundamentally a slightly different way of approaching a lot of these same problems. All right. So talked a little bit about the future of accounting teams. I am sure a lot of people are leaving this webinar hopefully really excited about getting their feet wet in AI, maybe diving a little bit deeper for folks who have played around with tools in the past. So before we get into Q&A, I personally found it helpful to hear a little bit about how OpenAI thought about where do we start? How do we increasingly begin to weave in AI in other aspects of our accounting team? And so Samia, would love if you could share a little bit about like your rollout as a sort of use case, a case in point of how teams should be thinking about where to start.
Yeah, for sure. And so I've been with OpenAI for over a year, like joined, a few months after the launch of ChatGPT. And like most people in industry, one, it's a little like jaw-dropping to see what can this what is even this sorcery? So similar to most people, like initially our use cases were like, can it write a memo for me? Can it like summarize this contract? And you give it a lease agreement and it puts it into a table format and grabs all the key terms for you. And I think our initial use cases were very much, all the text generation and policy memo generation. Granted, I think what Parker, you showed us earlier today is just a much more robust version of the thing we were doing 15 months ago, because you now have these comp set data, you have the, technical accounting guidance. I think like we've evolved so much more since that time. But if you're a company and you're thinking, how do I just like get my hands wet doing this? I think like that is just a good starter point. You can have it write a T&E policy, you can give it an existing policy and have it refresh. And I think those are kind of like very low inhibition, like pretty easy to kind of start examples. The next iteration was kind of this realization that, wait a second, engineers don't have time to help us, but we can ask this thing to write code for us. And I think that was quite a long, quite a big, like kind of seismic shift in how we did a lot of work. And initially, those looked like people generating Python scripts or SQL queries and running them locally and in their own computer. And then, those processes have now evolved over the last like year or so to say, maybe the script can now run in the cloud and with like better version controlling. And, somebody doesn't need to hit run even on their computer. You can just like schedule these jobs. So we've kind of gotten more and more mature, but the starting point was somebody like putting their stream of consciousness, like I showed you earlier, and just like having that dialogue with ChatGPT. Um, and then we got into the expense policy GPTs. I've been like kicking around this, journal entry GPT idea where you teach this thing debits and credits for a type of transaction. And then you basically have this GPT be a JE bot kind of. I've gotten it to work somewhat reliably right now. I show this to my team, but I think people are still skeptical that it's actually going to do it right. So still working on that, but the micro product world is like super exciting, and I'm just excited for everyone to kind of play around with this and see what they come up with. And where we are today is now that we've kind of tinkered around with the ad hoc workflows, we're really doing like where can we plug in these very awesome like AI enabled tools into our workflows. So the minute I've seen this like auto flux explanation, I think my reaction to Parker was like, can we have a button way at the top that just writes all of these in one go? It's like, this is like peak laziness, right? One, the thing is doing your job for you, but two, like, no, I don't even want to click the button, make it click for me. Uh, but jokes apart, I think these are the things that are just like incredibly valuable. And to Parker's point, the underlying models will keep getting smarter. And I can't share too much publicly, but the idea that you know it's just able to like pass the CPA exam with an amazing score is kind of like the leading indicator of just how much it's able to like think through the various like topics we need to understand. And so that has been a little bit of our journey in how we've adopted AI over the last like 18 months or so.
Awesome. And for folks who are trying to get started, who are maybe early on in that journey, we will follow up with both. Our team has written a baseline AI explainer. If you learned the word ChatGPT for the first time on this, which maybe there are some of you out there that's true, and that is very okay, we will define that in a lot of those fundamental principles and a couple of example use cases of how teams are actively using this in a prompt guide. So lots coming in the follow-up email to this, but I want to make sure that we have time to get to the Q&A. So I will go ahead and stop my screen share. I've seen tons of questions coming in. So let's go ahead and start with a couple. One of so we have one, have you seen AI workflows being implemented into banking activities? That is a big risk for finance teams. So a little more narrow in the use case. Samya, Parker, anything come to mind for some of those workflows?
Yeah, I don't think I have any particular insights here. I think there's definitely sort of applications we should expect around classification, and obviously sort of there's so much messy bank data and codes and pieces that you can then use to categorize more effectively. But yeah, Sami, I'm not sure if you guys have seen anything in particular.
For like set and forget type things.
I think for sort of I mean, I do think the point that like banking activities are a high risk and like one should probably not let AI just go send wire transfers is probably a pretty good idea. But I think in terms of classification and sort of taking the data exhaust from the systems, there's probably quite a bit that should continue to improve in terms of bank reconciliations and classifications and the likes.
Yeah, I think this is still a work in progress. I think one area that like I'm personally really excited about is, could AI build a really good recon for you? And it's mostly like doing this on its own. It is somewhat low risk in the sense that a recon doesn't impact your financial books. It might inform how whether you need an AJE or not, but it has all this underlying data. It can actually understand, beyond like looking up transactions. It can, maybe say these two transactions are just the reversals of this other thing. So maybe we eliminate those and like this is what's making it up. I think these are tools that we just haven't had today. And, like most accountants in the room will agree that like reconning has been a big part and maybe some painful ones that they remember. And the idea that you open a file and it's mostly done and maybe you're tweaking it or reviewing it, I think that's a great starting point.
Awesome. A slightly different question, which I think is really interesting, of are the AI tools supported by your corporate IT, or is this something that's owned and managed by finance in your team? So I'm guessing this is wildly dependent on team, but yeah, would love to hear maybe Samia for OpenAI's use case, who typically is owning those tools.
This is like you said, Tierney, like this is very much a function of how big your company is. In our company, um, we own it, but we're also an AI company that the IT team is very pro this, obviously, but like we had, maybe we were the first enterprise workspace for ChatGPT. So it's like it's a little bit different. I will say, from like what we see on the sales side, we sell to both finance teams and we sell to IT teams that adopt this more broadly for their whole company. But in most cases, finance teams have this very tangible, like, I can see this adding value to my team immediately. So even if IT is who manages it, finance teams are the ones pushing for, like, let's please get this for our team because it'll save us so much time.
Awesome. I'm going to throw a different question over to Parker because I know this is something our team spends a lot of time thinking about. We got the question of, is it possible to arrive at a point where we are closing in one day or maybe even closing on day zero with AI? Any immediate thoughts to that horizon, the one day close?
I love that question, Amir. Uh, I think two discrete three discrete quick thoughts. One, we work with so many companies where they're spending 10, 15 days closing the books. And I think that's almost like a hard mental thing to wrap your head around, given that your sort of initial instinct is like, oh, that's about half of your 30-day month. But really in practice, that's 3/4 of your 20-day work month. So I do think there's a real like emphasis here, which is we should try and drive these workflows down to as close to zero as possible so we can get back to doing the projects and the ad hoc work and kind of moving the business forward. I think we should be able to get to a like 1 day close. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the cool tool, like part of the things here is right, we have all this underlying data, whether it's making better estimates faster. There's always some level of trade-off of how much information do you have on day 0 or 1 to make decisions versus where is it better to wait and kind of collect more information. But I think we should start to see some really almost expectations of like, here's your flash financial statements day 0 with all the information we've collected. Maybe there's some things that still need to be finalized and reviewed. And you're starting to then actually benchmark that of, okay, well, maybe we finalized it on day 3 or 4 or 5, and then how different was it? What have we learned? And how do we do those things again? So I kind of think there's almost a world where we see more kind of like soft closing, like immediately and instantly, and then sort of like benchmarking ourselves on how close did we get. But we would love to see this pulled down to the sort of 1 day close become the new standard.
Great. One question that I think is a little more high level around how do teams keep documentation on the processes designed and supported by AI? And I'm guessing this is probably coming from both a new team member joins, sort of making sure everyone's aware, but also probably from an audit perspective too, of how are you sort of coaching your auditors to understand how AI is used?
I think I would challenge uh, the person asking this to be like, why is this any different than you doing a manual workbook and the process that you document for that? And I actually had the same conversation when doing a walkthrough with our auditors to say, this is going to look really freaking different from anything you've seen before. But if you zoom out, this is just a different way to do the same thing to the data that we were previously doing. And in some ways, actually much easier to follow because you're now not like auditing 20 different Excel files. You're auditing like one script. And so none of the rigor around controls documentation and just putting like the audit trails in there changes. In fact, I would say it's maybe even more critical and not something that we take for granted to say, I put it into this tool and it spit out something.
Yeah.
Awesome. I know we are just at time. We have so many other questions in the chat, which I think tells me that there's a lot more we could talk about on this topic. So maybe future webinars, definitely slated. Do want to say thank you to Samia for taking time telling us a little bit about how the OpenAI team is using AI, Parker for sharing a little bit about what teams are doing now, but also sneak peek into the horizon and sort of as we approach that dream of the 1 day, 0 day close and what that looks like. And do want to thank everyone for the thoughtful questions, the engagement, really appreciate it. And we'll follow up with some additional resources on how your team can get up and running with a lot of these AI tools. So thank you, both of you, and appreciate everyone for joining.
Yeah. Samia, thank you so much for making the time. We really appreciate it.
Of course, thanks for having me. Great chat.
All right. See you, everyone.